Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming to our third webinar in our academic Road to Tenure Academic Career Trajectory series. These webinars are hosted by the Division for Research, and we are very happy to have you here today. Myself, Bree Jimenez, I'm at the University of Texas at Arlington, and Sarah Powell at University of Texas at Austin. Will be your kind of moderators and hosts today, but we have multiple wonderful guests, DR members and guests here to share their experiences and expertise along the way as well. This webinar series, like I said, is brought to you by the Division for Research. If you are interested, we are always happy to take small donations, just something to kind of help us fund the programming and continue to do this. Feel free to look at the URL here and make a small donation. You can also do that on our website. Think about, if you're not already a member, think about joining the Division for Research as we continue to support programming, to support special education research and support researchers along the way as well, and policy and advocacy within these areas of special education research. So we are on our third of the series right here for the Road to Tenure and Pre-Tenure Series. Today we're going to be talking about research and service, but if you have missed any of the previous two webinars, they are available on our YouTube channel, which I'll post into the chat today, and you can find those and watch those. Please share those with colleagues, students, friends, and know that they're there for you, in the future to go back and look at it if you need to. And then we will have one more within this 4 series on the tenure committee next week. So please join us again next week if you can, or again, these will be on the YouTube channel if you weren't able to join in live today. The chat box is open. Please, please, please post any chats, comments. We love to keep this as interactive as possible. Obviously, with a lot of different people coming in, we'll ask if you have any questions, and we'll kind of take some breaks where feel free to unmute and ask some questions. But we'll also, if you want to put them into the chat box, we can help moderate that and be able to either embed them into what we're talking about or take a break really quick to answer some of those questions. Again, we want to be able to interact with you as much as we can, so please do use the chat box and we can reply back and forth to each other as well. So we have asked DR members to share their stories on their pathway to tenure. We do realize that our tenure path might have looked different as we're sharing our stories than maybe some of you who are currently on that path looking at the pandemic and COVID-19. So we do plan on trying to incorporate that as much as we can today. Please ask questions. We can definitely field those questions and talk about it, especially relating to COVID-19. But also in session 4, we do plan on talking with senior level members of P&T committees, so that we can maybe share some of those ideas and what's going on right now in those discussions within those committees, and maybe what's happening at different universities as they discuss P&T currently, and that might be able to help guide it. So we are very happy and excited to invite Chris Lemons and Chris, President-elect, right, of DR, from Stanford University to share. So Chris, I'll let you introduce yourself and maybe tell us a little bit about that picture.
Hi all, so I'm Chris Lemons, a faculty member in special ed at Stanford. This is one of my favorite pictures. This is actually the first job that got me to start working with kids with disabilities. So I graduated from UT Austin, Hokum Sarah, and had a degree in psychology and really struggling trying to find a job. And I was asked if I would do this after school care program, but they would only let me do it if I took the group of kids with disability. And I was like, okay, that sounds fine, it's a job. And this is us playing 5 o'clock Uno. So every day we cleaned up the room, and you could only play Uno if you helped clean, and then you had to dress up from the dress up box. So these are the first kids that kind of got me on this path.
And why might there be a pig on the bottom corner?
I don't know. Why is the pig there, Sarah?
Well, everybody has a little tidbit about themselves that they didn't know. And you told me that you used to raise piglets. Is that true?
That is true. Yeah, I grew
Uh,
up on a farm, and so my summers were spent delivering baby pigs.
how many baby pigs did you deliver when you were growing
Oh,
up?
I'm sure over 100, like lots of little
Wow.
pigs.
Okay.
Did you
All
keep
right.
any
Little,
as a pet?
no.
Aw. All right, thank you. Thanks for joining us today. Melissa, would you mind introducing yourself?
Hi, everyone. So my name is Melissa Driver. I'm an associate professor at Kennesaw State University, which is just outside of Atlanta. And my picture, this is actually from the day that I got word of tenure, which was just this past April.
Aw.
And so it's like a very pandemic tenure announcement picture in my mind. It's a nice little time capsule where I'm like, I don't know if this was in the morning or if children wore pajamas the entire day. There's like a bottle of disinfectant in the background. So it's like a lot of little Easter eggs in there. And my little tidbit is not as great as delivering pigs, but I did throughout my whole tenure track time, I did also work as an exercise instructor part-time, which was like a really fun little balance. Also not as great as that yoga icon, but it's still fun.
Excellent. Steve.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Steve Ciullo, and I'm at Texas State University. And for anyone who's unfamiliar with Texas, as I used to be, Texas State is right between Austin and San Antonio. So San Marcos is right in the middle. But we live in Austin. The picture there is my wife, Rachel, and our little guy, Max, who's now 3. He looks a lot bigger than this. It's crazy how much can change in a year. But I'm an associate professor of special ed at Texas State, and my work is really in the area of writing and content area literacy for students with disabilities. And I see my clever little icon there that Sarah added for me. So my tidbit is that before going into education and throughout most of my early life, my ultimate goal was to own an Italian restaurant. My grandma was a pretty phenomenal cook, and she would make, in the kitchen, she'd make homemade spaghetti. So I wanted to open up a restaurant with my grandma. So that there's still a lot, and I like to cook, so that still kind of stays with me.
Wonderful. So when you'll see these icons coming through as our webinar progresses, and when you see those icons, we'll know a little bit of where maybe some of those comments and thoughts might be coming from. So along the way, we've talked about the tenure package in our previous webinars as well. And this webinar, we want to focus specifically on, you've kind of looked at your publication list, you've already done your research statements, you're putting all that together, but now really thinking about the teaching component. And so teaching statements, course evaluations, teaching observations, potentially from students, peers, service statements, and all of these things come together. But this webinar, we wanted to focus on this component of that tenure package.
All right, thank you, Bree. Thanks so much for that introduction. So today we're going to work on teaching and service. I accidentally wrote services up there in the top, so apologize for that. And today we're going to talk with Chris, Melissa, and Steve about what are some of the teaching expectations to tenure, what are the service expectations to tenure, and then how do they write cohesive teaching and service statements for their tenure package. So let's go ahead and get started. We are first going to focus on teaching today, and we are going to talk about time devoted to teaching. And then as you are teaching, how do you improve your teaching? And then as you're putting together your tenure package, how do you write about those decisions that you've made along your pathway to tenure? So let's go ahead and start talking about how much time and effort do you invest in your teaching? And we ask this question because we know that some of you are at institutions where research might be a little bit more of a focus for you. And then some of you are at institutions where you balance teaching, research, and service. And so let's think about, how did you decide how much time and effort to spend on your teaching? So Chris, one of the things that you mentioned is that you block blocked time on your calendar for planning and grading of coursework. Could you tell us a little bit about how you came to that decision to have time on your calendar just devoted to teaching?
Yeah, so I think the idea here, I think many of us are probably perfectionists in a lot of ways, and you can spend decades on preparing perfect PowerPoints. And I think you can really get yourself in trouble if you start the day off, on Monday, your class is on Thursday, and you spend all day Monday, all day Tuesday, all day Wednesday getting class ready. And so I think it's just really important to remember that teaching is a percentage of your job, and figuring out at your university what percentage that is. If you're at a research one, it is not a very large percentage. And so just making sure that you're not overcommitting your time. So in addition to this, I would say put writing on your time and don't do teaching stuff during writing time. And then the other thing that in this little box I thought was important is just be smart about how you design assignments. In my first year of teaching at Pitt, I taught an assessment class and had a 30 question midterm that was all open questions. It took
Oh,
me about 5 solid days to grade them. I never did that again. So just think about when you're designing assignments to make them things you can grade efficient.
that's a really, really great feedback there, Chris. Now, Steve, you kind of like Chris said that you spend 4 to 6 hours per week planning and grading. How did you come to that number? Was that something that you launched into in your first year in a tenure track position, or is that something that you've worked on over the years?
That's a good question. And I think similar to Chris, what I had to do is spend some time during the first 2 years really thinking about the breakdown of teaching, research, and service at my university. And I realized that because my particular university has kind of a balance between, we kind of have like a 2-2 or 2-3 teaching load, that 4 to 6 hours I thought was enough time that I could provide good activities, good lesson preparation while not digging into my writing days. So I was really pretty diligent about maintaining a strict calendar where my classes, I think, were like Tuesday and Wednesday. So I would spend Monday doing all my prep and grading. And then the other days, so that I wasn't like cramming before class. And then the other days I would have writing time carved out. So I was more disciplined than I thought I would be when it came to really blocking out those times on the calendar. But for me, 4 to 6 hours was sort of the sweet spot.
The sweet spot. Now we have a question that's come in from the chat, Steve, and I'm going to toss this one to you. So Lisa asks, says, sometimes she says 4 to 6 hours sounds great. I'm spending maybe 8 hours preparing for one lecture. So the question is, do you just draw a line and say it's good enough? Like, how did you kind of say like, okay, I need to stop here?
That's a really good question. Well, I'll sort of temper that statement with, I think during my first year, it could have crept up a little bit, but each year that number reduced a little bit. So I think if any of you listening are in your first year, it probably will get better next year. But yes, I did actually just draw a line where I just kind of said, these are the major objectives I want to get for this week. And I'm going to do what I can to prepare during that block of time, because I wasn't really willing to take away from my writing time.
Okay, great. Now, Melissa, I'm going to turn it to you. You gave us some really good feedback about time and effort related to your teaching. And so one of the things I want to ask you about is your comment that's over on the right-hand side about online versus face-to-face teaching. And I liked this idea that you said when you're doing online preparation, you just take 2 full weeks at the beginning of the semester and you just do it all. So could you tell us a little bit about how you came to make that decision?
Yeah. So my first year, and again, you might not always have that opportunity. Like my first year teaching, I was handed my one online class, the day before classes start, and it was completely a mess. And I'd never made an online class before. So that one was very much each week I would make it, but I found that I was still putting like a lot of time into the design and the creation of that. Once I've made like one online class, I feel like you can kind of I just get faster at making them. So for me, I have found that I would much rather go hide upstairs or go to my office for really long days for 1 to 2 weeks in right before the semester starts, and just really full on backwards design, get everything fleshed out, maybe leave a few small things for the semester. But then that like upfront time when I'm so immersed in it, I'm so much more efficient in getting the content planned. And then it makes for a much more enjoyable teaching experience throughout the week. Cause like Steve said, I'll typically try and get my Mondays to be my like main teaching day then, where I can like make sure all the emails are caught up on,
Mm-hmm.
all the grading done, which also really helps because then if you can have a really quick response grading time, students really value that and appreciate, and
Yeah.
that typically comes out in evaluations. And then it just like frees up that mental space for me to just kind of like check in and provide ongoing support throughout the rest of the week.
Well, and I even like that idea, Melissa, if I was teaching a face-to-face class. I've never done this, but maybe if I just did take a week and at least finish maybe the first 6 or 7 lectures of the class, then that would allow more time for the semester for me to focus on grading, focus on mentoring, and focus on other things that I'm really interested in. Michelle has a question in the chat about how we define teaching. Michelle, I'm going to come back to that at the end of this teaching section because I think you'll see some stuff in each of our teaching example statements that might get to this idea of what is teaching. So our next question that we asked is, one of the things about teaching is that you teach a course and you get these evaluations, whether it's informal evaluations or whether it's formal evaluations. And so how did you make improvements to your teaching? Because that's one of the things that I know tenure committees are always really interested in. If you had maybe low scores or kind of a bad comment one semester, they want to know how you responded to that. So Steve, one of the things that you told us about is that you joined TED. So could you tell us a little bit about some of the resources that you used with TED and why that was a helpful way for you to improve your teaching?
I'm glad I joined TED, and I wish I would have even done it sooner. So the awesome thing that I love about CEC is that you have all these different organizations that specialize in different things. So you have DR really building our capacity to be research, DLD focuses on different issues. And I had heard about TED and it always sounded like a really fun community. And I joined, I think in my second or third year, because I really was interested in knowing, not just from my perspective, but what do colleagues across the country do to prepare teachers really well? And what does the research say? So I thought TED was a nice balance because, you have people, like Michael Kennedy and Mary Brunell and people like that who really are putting a lot of effort into course design and figuring out how to provide effective PD and teaching. So joining TED was cool because they have like syllabus shares at a lot of their sessions. When you go there to the TED conferences, it just felt like an open forum and a safe place to discuss strategies for class.
That's a
So
really good suggestion. I like
yeah,
that. And join DR as well, right? TED and DR. We have to put both of those on there.
for sure.
Now, Chris, I want to talk to you a little bit about something that I know has happened to me is negative feedback. And so could you comment a little bit about how you responded to some negative feedback on your student evaluations?
Yeah, so I think
But that may have been Melissa. I'm sorry,
yeah,
but I'll give it to you, Chris. Yeah.
No, Melissa can take it.
Well, no, I'd love to hear what you have to say too, Chris. I'll say the only thing about mine is just that, look for the patterns. Like this past semester, I had one student say that she thought these weekly recaps I would send out was like a total waste of my time. But then I had like 20 who were like, this was life-changing. Thank you so much. So I'm not going to worry as much about that one piece.
Yeah.
So I
I
feel like
think
really
that's a
like
great comment.
line it up with what you see.
And Chris, what would you say when you've received negative feedback?
I just think don't take it personally. And I think it is shocking to me, the very personal things you get. And I think particularly if you're female, you're going to get comments on how you dress and on your shoes. And it's just, you just have to read through them quickly, see if there's anything that improves your teaching and get over it. And, actually, I used to keep a drawer with some of the most crazy feedback because some of it was just really funny. Right? People said that, I was super ditzy most of the time. People loved that I wore different color shoes, and I'm like, this is not really related to teach. So,
but at least you have, nice shoes in your closet, I guess, right?
Yeah,
Now,
good shoe game is important.
The shoe game is important. Now, both Melissa and Chris shared with us how they collect informal feedback from their students. So Melissa, this is an example of your mid-course feedback. Could you tell us a little bit about why you do this and then what you do with this information?
Yeah, so it's always helpful to kind of just get that pulse check on how the students are feeling about everything before the end of the semester. Like evaluations are great for the next year, but they don't help you with that year. And so this is just helpful to see, like what's going well, what could be improved. And I always try and situate it into like a realistic context, right? So like, I'm not going to drop all of the rest of your assignments, or master's program is hard. But then the one that's really helpful for me is the how many hours a week are you spending on the course? Because it helps students really actually think about how long are they spending. It can feel overwhelming. And then for the ones who put the higher marks, it's anonymous. So I ask them to email me and say, like, I would like to help you get this number down. And
Oh,
so it just
great.
shows that support, and also shows the willingness to like that I want to receive feedback and I want to learn and grow, which is the same thing I'm asking you to do. So it helps build that relationship too.
Well, and I bet the students find that really, really helpful to have your help taking down the number of hours they work on a course per week. Chris, you shared with us something that you do per week. So could you tell us a little bit about the strip and how you developed this and what information you gain from this?
Yeah, so I think I did this my first year of teaching because, kind of like Melissa, I ended up getting feedback at the end of the semester that I was like, gosh, I wish I would have had some of that along the way. So
Mm,
I do this thing called the strip. Students rank anonymously 1 to 5 how much they learned, 1 to 5 how much they enjoyed class, and then they can write anonymous comments on the back, or I do it electronically now. And those can be things like either I like the activity, I didn't like it, or I understood, or I need more focus on this. And then what I do is actually start off every class with a progress monitoring graph. And I make it very clear to the students that my goal is to be above a 4, hopefully above a 4.5. And then I post their comments like, well, it's very interesting. 4 of you hated the small group activity and 6 of you liked it. So we're going to do that sometimes, not always. And so it's just a way that I can communicate very clearly with the students that not all of them are feeling the same. And it also makes it clear sometimes that learning and enjoyment aren't the same thing sometimes.
hmm
And so, but I also use this to have very um, candid conversations about what I think my teaching evaluation score should be when they do that. And so I kind of tie the two together.
That's great. Thank you, both Melissa and Chris, for sharing those resources. Now I want to switch to your teaching statement that you sent into your tenure committee for your tenure package. And what did you emphasize? And we're actually going to show a few examples from you all. So Chris, how did you put together your teaching statement? What did you emphasize in yours?
I think for me, I focus on the fact that I'm really bringing my research into the classroom and making sure that the teachers know evidence-based practice. I think it's helpful to make it clear that I do care that my students are going to become high quality special ed teachers. So I'm contributing to the field through that. But then I think it's also helpful, the component, I think I got the most positive feedback that of using the strip, that I was really reaching out to students and trying to get their input and feedback. And I think demonstrating that you're a responsive instructor that cares about the outcome, I think is one of the most important things you could do in your statement.
I agree. And Melissa, I'm going to move on from your quote to the next slide because we actually have an example of your teaching statement and I'm going to have you describe that there. So here it is. So Melissa was so great to submit. This is part of her statement for promotion and tenure. And so Melissa, do you want to tell us a little bit about how you put this together? And I tried to point out some important parts, but tell us a little bit about how you developed this statement related to your teaching.
Sure. So in our narrative, teaching comes first. So I kind of organized that up at the very beginning, talking about how I'd move through the sections. Really connecting to a theoretical frame is important for our committee and our P&T committee in our department. So I also did that up front, and also just to situate like why I kind of approached instruction the way I did. For our university, it is appropriate to include direct quotes from either other faculty or students. And so that is one thing that I liked doing because it just helped provide that immediate evidence. We had to, all the numbers you see are all the many links to the artifacts that we had to do. But having just those little quotes in here too, I think just helps speak to the narrative as well. And then also, so I chose like highlighted practices that came up a lot in reviews or that students often spoke to, and then I could have the evidence to support that. And then talk, just like Chris was saying, about how I was responsive over the last, however many years, and made changes based on student needs, and, constantly try to become a better teacher.
And I think these are the next two pages here. I do like how you pointed out that how you engaged in professional learning to improve your teaching and scholarship. And you also had a student that won an award, and then you were honored for an award. So I like that you mentioned that in your statement. Now, on the next page, you have some examples of these artifacts. I think this is just absolutely awesome. So how did you know which artifacts to include? When did you collect these? Like, how did you put all of these artifacts together?
Yeah, so I try and have a folder each year that, like, when something comes in, so if you get an award or if a student emails you a really kind email that speaks to something you did, that I'll just immediately like PDF and save it in that folder. And then honestly, this is where, even when we do our yearly reviews, which are in a narrative form, kind of almost like mini tenure reviews. So I'll actually start with the evidence a lot of times and then write from that. So if I have
Hmm.
all of these artifacts organized nicely for the year, then I can say, okay, so, I had 2 students who won honor student awards and they picked me as their faculty honorees. Or this, I got this letter from a career thing. And so then I can kind of have that all there and then start piecing that together to help tell the story, and then then put the rest of the narrative, put it there.
And I like how you're doing this ongoing, because I think it would be really hard to do this in year 5 or 6 and go back and unearth some of that stuff from year 1. The other thing I really like that you did, Melissa, which is over here on the right-hand side, is you actually have a picture of you teaching online. And so you can see how you're interacting with your students. And that's something that I never really think about, but I think that some of our viewers today might want to, think about collecting these artifacts as they go. And they may include them in their tenure package or they may not, but then that could also help with the writing of that teaching statement. Chris, are these statements available for the attendees? The entire session is recorded and we put it on the DR YouTube channel. And we're also very happy to share this PowerPoint if anybody is interested in that. All right, and now Steve, you were also really nice to share your teaching statement. Your teaching statement was only a page and a half, and I'm guessing that's because you had page restrictions there. But could you tell us a little bit about how you developed this teaching statement when you submitted your tenure package?
The first thing I tried to do, which does relate to the teaching statement, is, I think I was just mentioning this to someone else, is my advisor at UT always told me to sort of like try to picture a thread and think about how teaching, service, and research fit together. And I kind of used that for part of my theoretical framework. So, no surprise that in the area of special education, many of us, have been trained in principles of explicit instruction. So I really, just like Melissa and Chris, I really made sure that I talked about how the theoretical underpinnings of the strategies and the processes that we teach is actually integrated and modeled by me in my own classroom. The other thing I did is kind of, I think this is kind of like what Melissa said, is I would, or maybe yeah, actually it is similar. I'd start with the quantitative portion, and then I would go through and then give some quotes and give some kind of narrative, because I think it brings it to life more.
Mm-hmm.
I think the committees generally, of course, want to see that you have high quantitative scores on student evaluations, but I think those personal touches, especially, I'm quite jealous of the ones that Melissa showed now. I think that really, really helps.
Yeah.
And then as you can see at the end, I really, for each section, for service, tenure, and teaching, I did include a paragraph about how that particular area relates to the others. So for like, I would show the connection between teaching and service. For service, I talked about how, reviewing for lots of journals can help with learning about methodologies and things like that.
Great. Thanks so much for sharing that, Steve. So before we move on, our next section is going to be about service, but I want to pause and go back to a question that came in from Melissa. So Melissa asked, or Michelle, I'm sorry, Michelle. Michelle asked, how do you define teaching? She said that they're working on revising their tenure and promotion guidelines, and this is a question that is posed. So Chris, you commented on that, but would you like to share that with the group about how you think about defining teaching?
Sure. I mean, I think teaching primarily is the classes that you lead, but I think it also counts like the mentoring you do. And so I think in this section, it's important to talk about how you mentor students. And at all the universities I've been at, doing mentoring of undergrads has been always seen as being very important. And so one of the things when I was at University of Pittsburgh was to bring in undergrad honor students into my research lab. And so I was able to talk about that. And I think that's very
Cool.
important, especially as your tenure file goes out of your department and to the provost, that they often don't know what's going on in your department. And
Mhm.
so showing that you're supporting undergrads, I think can be very meaningful when your file makes it that far.
That's a really good suggestion. Melissa, do you have anything to add in terms of a definition of teaching?
At our university, it also includes all doctoral advising, as well as some program coordination that's kind of split between teaching and service. So I think that the more it gets difficult, the broader it gets, because it then just does become this all-encompassing thing. So I don't know. I feel like the more, specific you can kind of make it to the actual like teaching and specific mentoring of like
Mhm.
students in the program and classes, the easier it will be for faculty to write too.
Yeah, and to evaluate for tenure as well. All right, we're going to move on and focus on service. And so we are going to think about time devoted to service. How did you make choices as to which service activities to go after? How did you seek out service if you weren't being asked to engage in enough service activities? And then finally, how did you write about your service? So let's go ahead and go on here. So our first question is about time and effort related to service. And I think this is something that many of us struggle with because service many times is fun, service is interesting, and service is, something you like to do with other people, but it can take a lot of time. So Steve, let's start off with you and tell us a little bit about how you chose your service activities, especially in the first few years in your tenure track position.
My particular university, and it's probably similar to a lot of yours, they were pretty good about making sure that our service was somewhat limited during years 1 through 3. So we had to, really participate in departmental service, but some of the university-wide service, like presentations, college or university level committees, that wasn't really suggested that early. So what I did is I would listen to, of course, my direct colleagues, but I was particularly interested and still am in national service and just because it's just a great way to connect with people from
Mhm.
all over the field. So really my first big entry was really just reviewing articles for a lot of different journals. And of course you have to be careful about that because that can eat up some time.
For sure.
But I think my first two big things that were exciting and tied to my other areas were reviewing for articles and joining committees through places like DR and DLD.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Now, Chris, one of the things you mentioned was this idea about journal reviews, and you have a good strategy for not taking on too many journal reviews at a time. Could you tell us a little bit about how you do this?
Sure. So especially early on, I would just have on my little to-do list one line for journal reviews. And if I had something that I had accepted, I would just decline all other journal reviews. And I think um, sometimes in the beginning, I think you feel like, oh my goodness, if I say no, they're never going to ask me back. Oh, they'll ask you back. Just wait. So it's perfectly fine to decline journal invitations.
And Chris, I feel that I get a lot of asks from journals, sometimes journals that I've never heard of. So does that happen to you? And how do you choose which journal reviews to accept?
So I try to choose the journals that I want to be most supportive of. So like Exceptional Children, Journal of Special Ed. If I get invitations for journals that I've never heard of, especially now I get really crazy ones like that I don't even know if they're legitimate journals. So I just delete those emails immediately. But sometimes if there is, if it's a journal that I don't know of, like maybe an international journal, I sometimes will review it if I feel like this is a really close study, like to my area, or I might
Mhm.
learn something from it. Um, but don't be afraid to decline. And I actually think I used to be a journal editor, and I truly appreciated when people would immediately decline instead of like waiting for a while to decline. And so actually that is what I do now. Like when I get a journal request, I either like I look at it and I either immediately accept or immediately decline, because I think it helps the process move along quicker. And I also think you often get asked to put in other names for reviewers. I think if you would like to do that, you can, but also don't feel obligated to do that, because it's not your job to do the editor's work of finding reviewers.
Well, and don't sign up somebody else for a lot more work, right?
Right.
Yeah. So Melissa, one of the things that you talked about is that at your university, services is really important. And so how did you said you talked about setting boundaries and prioritizing service commitments. How did you set those boundaries and what did you prioritize?
So I think it's just important to remember that it's okay to advocate for yourself. You are on a tenure clock and you're on a tenure track, and your chair knows that, and hopefully your whole department will be supportive of that. So, for example, with program coordination, that can be really impactful for both a department and college. Can give you a lot of leadership, can lead to a lot of like curricular development leadership, all of which can very nicely tie into your teaching and how you
Mhm.
represent yourself, but it can take a lot of time. So if you do it, and depending on if there's any reassigned time with it, really advocating to make sure you're teaching in the program you're coordinating helps streamline a lot. And then, the more you can connect your research initiatives to the coordination, the better. It just, again, it helps everything align and streamline, which just helps your time in the end.
Great suggestion. And I think everyone here is emphasizing also the power of saying no to things, which I think is an important thing as you develop your know-how in terms of going up for tenure. Now, one of the things I'd like to talk to you, Steve, is about how did you decide which service activities to engage in? So you said that there was some level of service that was expected, but then how did you choose what to engage in?
I was fortunate, just like a lot of people in here, to have mentors, not just from UT, my primary institution where I got my doctorate, but just really good colleagues around the field, people like Chris, people like Stephanie Alateba and Erica Lemke. And I really wanted to get their perspectives on someone who, like me, who really wants to participate in service, but also wants to do things that are meaningful for the field. Like, what are some of the good things to do? And these mentors were just extremely helpful with kind of steering me in terms of, this committee would be really good. I think the first one I did with DLD was one with Chris, and it was the Professional Development Standards and Ethics Committee. And it was just a nice entryway into that area. So really talking to friends and talking to trusted mentors, including your current or former advisors, I think that's always a great place to start making those choices.
Definitely agree. Now, Melissa and Chris, in terms of, how did you choose which service to partake in? Chris, you talked about staying away from projects that are more show than impact. Could you comment a little bit on that?
So I think universities and academics love to have committees that spend a lot of time thinking and talking and admiring problems, but not actually solving those problems. And so I think it's really useful to find committees that there is a clear endpoint to. So for example, one of the things I said on my previous slide was it's good to volunteer early for the committees that are going to be less work. So it's kind of like fools rush in and get the best seats, I think. But like the idea of like, one of the best committees to be on is the annual research committee, which is like the only thing that committee does is once a year sit down and review some research proposals, give those awards out, and you're done. And so that is a type of committee that I think is really good for early career people because it has a clear set of work. Whereas if you're on the like curriculum revision committee to reconsider our program for the next decade, that's like a committee that you're going to meet 1,000 hours and it's just going to take up a lot of your time. And so when you join those committees that have a lighter lift, you can, when someone comes and invites you for the bigger lift, you can say, oh, I'm actually pre-tenure and I'm already on a very important committee. And so I also think, talking with your program chair, either when you're interviewing or early on about, how your time can be protected. And I think if you do feel like someone's asking you to do something that is more than you should at pre-tenure, go directly to your chair and raise that question, because that's their job to protect you.
Very good advice. And Melissa, one of the things that you commented on that was already a theme is you don't have to say yes to everything. Do you have any suggestions about how people can gracefully say no?
Yeah, so kind of what Chris was just mentioning too, if you're already on another committee or, really trying to leverage your workload, I think is really helpful because again, it's just objective data that if you're already teaching your X amount of classes and if you're already on this committee or you are serving in this way, or if you have some national service that will count towards P&T, because sometimes national service won't configure into your service load. So I think being really clear with your chair on if that counts as a part of your service load, or if that's just like, we just want you to do that for tenure, but you still need to be on these committees. So being clear on how your workload is made up and what the parameters are really helpful. Because then if you're asked to do something and you can kind of just lay your cards on the table and say, well, I'm already doing X, Y, and Z. And so given where I'm at on the tenure clock, I don't think, that fits with my agenda, and, really navigate those conversations based on the data.
And really being an advocate for yourself, because many times people ask you to do something and they don't always know that you're doing many other things. Now, in terms of seeking out service, because not all service activities come to you, I think one of the things we often have to think about is how do I engage in maybe local service, statewide service, national service, or even international service? So, Chris, could you tell us a little bit about how you chose what to volunteer for?
So I think I kind of answered this already
A
a
little
little.
bit,
So
yeah.
thinking of the light ones, but I also think it's volunteering for things where I have colleagues that I'm going to get to spend time with them. I think is something that I find to be really rewarding to me, because if I go to a committee and there's not anyone that I want to hang out with, then that can get kind of painful. But like if you're doing stuff that's like, oh, cool, we have this call and Steve's going to be on it, Sarah's going to be on it, Melissa's going to be on it. It's like, oh, awesome, let's do that. So I think of things that are, that I think will be enjoyable hanging out with people. And then also just things that are aligned with my interests. So if I'm really interested in improving how our undergrads interact with individuals with disabilities on campus, like being on a committee like that and forming it, I feel it's aligned with my goals and my mission. And so it doesn't feel like work that I'm just wasting my time. And so I think that's another thing to do, is just like, if I join that and spend 20 hours this year on that, am I going to feel like, oh, that was a good use of my time or not? I think that's another way to kind of evaluate.
And I think Melissa and Steve would both agree with that. And Steve, you already talked a little bit about your different mentors, but do you have anything else that you would like to add in terms of seeking out service activities?
One good piece of advice that I received early on that I still try to utilize to this day is to think about, when you get asked particularly to do college or university level service, to think about if they are an enduring form of service, like committees that are going to go on and on for years, like those curriculum ones Chris mentioned, or more like ones that might be busy in the short term, but are sort of meaningful. So for example, one of the things that you probably have at your universities is the opportunity to be on a scholarship review committee. And these are undergrad, first generation college students is the competition that we review for. And it's nice because it really gives you a chance to read these cool stories and, provide opportunities to new students. And it's busy, but it's only during 1 month of the time. So it's kind of a heavy lift during that time, but it's not like one of those committees that sort of drags on and on and on. So I think being attentive to the time commitments is also important.
Agreed. And Melissa, would you have anything to add in terms of seeking out service activities?
I'll just echo what Chris and Steve said about also just, making sure you're passionate about it. Like it will be your time. And so if you're so passionate about that, research to practice piece and professional development, or increasing access and opportunity, like Steve was just saying, if you have a stake in it, then it will make that time much more worth it.
Great. All right. And then now let's focus on, well, how did you talk about your service in terms of submitting for your tenure package? So Steve, tell us a little bit about what you emphasized in your service statement. Bless you.
Bless you. So Similar to what Melissa said earlier, that on a lot of the statements that you'll be asked to write, usually there are specific headers and sections that you have to follow. And I think the way that ours was organized might be similar to a lot of yours, is that we had to sort of break it down into different buckets of university, program, college. So I really just tried to be as organized as possible. And another tip that kind of helped me is when I was writing, I try to remember that the personnel committee are not all members of special education. So I tried to really
Good point.
unpack.
Very good point.
Yeah, I felt like it was important to unpack some of these service things and give some context to the organizations, because, you know, names like DR and DLD mean a lot to all of us here, but they don't necessarily mean a lot to people that are in art or history education. So I think just really talking about the organizations and why they're important was a helpful addition.
Wow, that's such an important thing to do. Melissa, can you tell us a little bit about how you wrote your service part of your tenure statement?
Yeah, so again, making those connections and linking between the research, the teaching, and the service, there are so many ways to connect that. So we talked about journal article reviews, just one or two lines of talking about how you, because you review for journals, you're in tune with the latest research coming in the field and how you integrate new journals into your classroom every semester. That's like one line, but it shows that connection between your service and your teaching. Same with, were you invited to be on any editorial boards? And then really thinking about, like, if you made an assignment and someone else is now using that or is asking you for your course research, are your course resources, and is that being replicated in other classes? Are people asking you for things? That's impacting more than just your own students. So really helping show that impact too, and that's leadership, that people are coming to you to ask for your assignments and your materials. And so really highlight that.
And, I think an example that I have that's personal to that is I do a lot of in-service professional learning for teachers. And so I emphasize that in my service statement, that not only was I working with pre-service teachers at my university, but I was translating our research to practice by providing service to school districts or to state level organizations. So that might be something people want to do as well. Now, Chris, you shared a little bit of the kind of the parts of your teaching and your mentoring and your service statement that you submitted for your tenure package. So can you tell us a little bit about how you wrote this statement?
Yeah, so I think, one of the things that I think as you're going up for tenure, the committee is going to be trying to determine, are you on a path to establishing a national reputation? And again, coming from a research one, so mostly through research. So what I tried to do is I think Melissa's points were excellent there, that, demonstrate that, like, people are actually coming to me for, they wanted my expertise to be on a committee or, to do service outside of the university. I agree totally with Steve that you have to, in this statement, describe what everything is. Why is CECDR important and who is that organization? Because they're not going to know. But I also, again, think it is really helpful. I've been on tenure review committees where people say, kind of looks like this person is spending too much time on service, and their research is suffering. And so even in this statement, I think it's important to say, I'm doing all this service, but here's how it's connected to my research. And here's how, being an advisor for the National Center on Intensive Intervention, that's related to work that I do, and I'm bringing that expertise into my research. And so I think always making sure that even as they're reading this part of your statement, they're seeing your research come through, I think is important.
And I'm going to move to the second and third pages of yours. So I see that you were using, just like Steve emphasized and Melissa emphasized, headers that probably were mandated from your university. But was there anything else in here that I liked that you had a conclusion statement, kind of put this all together, but was there anything else that you'd like to comment on in terms of your statement here?
I think it's useful to get feedback on it before you submit it. So Naomi Zegman was, my champion when I was at University of Pittsburgh, and I loved her because she was like a mama bear. So like in public, she'd be very protective of me, but like go into the office and give you the statement. She'd be like, this is not good. You need to change all this. So I think it's helpful to find that mentor, and that can be someone at your university or not. It's probably helpful to have someone at the university who's had experience on the P&T committee to look at your statement, because they'll kind of know what the red flags are. But yeah, I think getting feedback on it. I mean, this statement is really important, and it really is amazing how much time the review committee spends on it.
Agreed.
And so devote a lot of time and revise and get feedback.
Well, and I think it's really helpful to see different statements. So we've seen artifacts from you and Steve and Melissa, but I also think it's really important to understand what your specific university expects. So I know when I was going up for tenure, there had been a faculty member in my department that had received tenure 2 years ahead of me. And so I emailed him and said, hey, can I see this, this, this? And he shared everything. And so it was really helpful for me to see what should this look like. He was talking all about autism, and I'm talking about mathematics, but it was really helpful to understand this is probably what my university is expecting. So I would give that advice to others, is to ask those who have just gone up for tenure above you to share any of the information that they're willing to share. All right, so now we're going to open it up for questions. We have just about 10 minutes left, so we're perfect in our timing. We just want to reiterate that when you're thinking about teaching, you should really think about your time devoted to teaching and limiting that if you think that's necessary. Think about your improvements to teaching. Both Melissa and Chris shared some really great feedback forms that they have their students fill in so that you can improve your teaching within the semester or across semesters. And then we also talked about how do you write about your teaching. And then we just talked about service. So what time do you devote to service? How do you make service choices? How do you seek out service opportunities? And how do you write that? All right, so it's now time for questions. We've already had one that's come in the chat. We are going to talk about this question in next week's workshop, but let's go ahead and ask this now. So this comes from Jihoon. Jihoon wants to ask, can you tell us who would be good as external letter writers? Chris, would you like to take a stab at this one first?
Sure, I think it's kind of so you want someone that you respect their work and you think their work is close enough to your work that they might actually know your work or who you are. um, but I also think it is helpful to ask senior people who've been on many P&T committees about letter writers, because when I was going up for tenure, I did that. Like so typically you end up taking, like you give a list of say 6 or 8, and then the university picks 6 or 8 and they create a committee off that. And you can also explicitly state who you don't want to be on that list. But what's helpful is I took my list to one of my dear colleagues that Sarah knows quite well. And she actually crossed 2 people off because she said they don't write good letters. They write letters that are too vague and they're not specific enough. And so that getting that kind of input is really helpful.
And I had that probably same person tell me this person writes really good letters, because they've seen them in different package submissions. And so having that feedback from senior level people is really helpful. A question's coming in from Lisa. When you decline a journal review, should you provide any explanation to the editor? Steve, would you like to answer this question?
Yeah, and I have a different view of this now because I just started recently becoming.
You did.
Yeah. I'm now one of the associate editors along with Sarah for the Journal of Learning Disabilities. So I think the kind of person I am is I'm sort of an over apologizer, even though I don't need to be apologizing. So
No,
I really don't think you need to provide an explanation. But I sometimes would if it was a journal that I'm a member of the editorial board, or if it was a journal that I aspired to be a part of the editorial board, because I wanted them to know that I do still value reviewing. This is really just a bad time. And then a lot of the journals now have, if you go into the review portal, you can go into the unavailable part. So like when it's time, when I'm going to be seeing my family, or if there's something else big going on, I will just make sure I'm listed as unavailable for those 2 or 3 weeks. So as an associate editor now, I sort of appreciate a little note, but it's absolutely not necessary. You don't have to apologize because everyone is busy, and that is understood. So it's really a personal choice.
Now, Marissa, we're going to get to your question in just a minute, but Steve, you just mentioned something about editorial boards. We didn't talk about that yet, but that is something that often people want to be on one or several editorial boards. It looks good on your CV if you do that before you go up for tenure. So could you tell us a little bit about how you got on an editorial board for a journal?
Is this one for me, Sarah?
Yeah, we'll start with you. Yeah.
So yeah, and I can give an example. So I tried to, just like Chris mentioned, really review for journals at first that I was interested in the work and that I thought could sort of further, help me grow as a researcher. So at first I was just reviewing for LDRP, LDQ, and JLD because a lot of my early work was really just focused on learning disabilities. So I think what happened is I just accepted and completed a lot of the reviews, and not too much. Of course, I would say no if I was unable to. But with time, I think what I did at first is I talked to other people that I knew were on the editorial board, and I just said like, hey, how does this work? Because I really don't know how one gets invited to this. And they kind of told me, and then I don't know if that person just sort of like advocated for me, but I don't think it hurt to have that conversation and sort of express that I was interested if there were ever spots to be opened up. So I didn't necessarily have to ask, I got invited. The other thing that Steph Alateba told me at JLD is that you often do get invited to join the board if you are doing thorough and quality reviews. So the thing, if I feel like I don't have the time to provide a thorough review, I will say no, because I want to make sure I'm doing a good job. Authors spend so much, weeks and months like writing these things. So I want to make sure that I'm being respectful to them and giving them feedback that I think will be helpful for improving their paper. And I think editors and associate editors, Chris and Sarah can speak to this, but I think that gets noticed.
Agreed. And I think that often it does get noticed. And so sometimes an editor for journal will ask associate editors, hey, is there anyone that's doing really great high quality reviews for you that you think should be on the editorial board? But I will also ask, I will add to this, Steve, that I advocated for myself to join editorial boards. So any review that you are asked to do, note that. I have a place on my CV where you can see every review that I've done for any journal. And after I was given some advice from a senior level mentor that after you've done 3 or 4 reviews, especially in a short amount of time, maybe 12 or 16 months, email the editor and say, hey, editor, I really love reviewing for your journal. In the past 12 months, I did this review, this review, this review, this review, and I would respectfully like to ask to be a member of your editorial board so I can continue to do these reviews. In every single one of those cases, they said, yeah, come on board, Sarah. And so I really advocated for myself, but I also limited this. I'm only on 4 editorial boards because you do get asked to do a lot more reviews. And those are the ones that are like really near and dear to my heart and really aligned with the research that I do. Melissa, I'm going to ask you a question. Marissa asked a question. What are some of your time-saving tips with teaching? I know Marissa is a first-year assistant professor, and so she's probably finding out that, man, you can spend a lot of time on teaching. So let's go ahead and give her some time-saving tips. Melissa, we'll start with you.
Definitely. So one thing that has come up is blocking off the time on your calendar and really trying to treat it as if it was a meeting. So not just like pushing it around, but committing to, if you've said you're going to work on your class this time, work on your class. Marissa, earlier I mentioned that I like to do a lot of upfront planning because I have just found for me, it helps everything be less stressful throughout because the time is less when the semester is in the middle of all of the, wild times that happen in the middle of the semester. And so I think really like learning what works for yourself. And so do you like to spend more time up front? Does that make your life easier? Or do you spend all that time and then spend a ton of time each week? Then it probably doesn't make sense for you to do all the upfront stuff. Just structure your time week by week. Likewise, for me, if I leave the grading till too late in the week, it really stresses me out and it just feels like that weight is hanging over me. But if I can knock it out early, then the rest of my week is more productive. So finding like, is that better for you to get it done earlier in the week? Does that help you later on? Or does that then eat up the entire week for you? You really just kind of learn like what works for you and keep note of what works for you.
Mhm. All right, well, we are going to go ahead and finish up there. I see we are at the top of the hour. So I want to thank Melissa and Steve and Chris. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think all of you provided just absolutely awesome advice. And we do want to remind you that we will be here next Friday. Next Friday, we have 4 senior level members who have been on many, many promotion and tenure committees. And they are going to join us and give you all of the inside secrets about what goes on in a promotion and tenure committee. So we're going to talk about how do you select letter writers? How do you like develop relationships with letter writers on your way to tenure? We're going to talk about completed tenure packages, and the questions have already gone out to them. And one of the questions that you really might be interested in is, why do people get tenure? And the second question is, why do people not get tenure? So I am really excited for next Friday. It's going to wrap up everything that we've been talking about over this webinar series. So thank you so much for joining us. And I will tease that if you want to learn about what happens after tenure, Jessica Tost and Emily Solari are going to be running 3 webinars about the associate's life. You don't have to have tenure to join into these. So if you are looking forward to what happens after you get tenure, please join us in April for those webinars. All right, thank you so much and have a great day.